Imagine standing in a kitchen where the foundational ingredient you're about to use smells so intensely of fermented, sun-dried, just decaying fish that your very first instinct might be to just throw it out the window.
Oh, absolutely. It is biologically alarming, to the uninitiated.
Right. But instead, you take that dense, pungent block, you wrap it in foil, and you hold it directly over an open gas flame. And as it roasts, that acrid funk begins to shift.
It's chemistry in action.
Exactly. It transforms into this deeply savory, intoxicating, roasted aroma that just suddenly makes your mouth water. You crush it up, mix it with some chilies, and suddenly you have created the most magnificent, umami-packed flavor bomb you've ever tasted.
It is the ultimate culinary sleight of hand. Taking something that seems like a mistake, honestly, and using heat and chemistry to turn it into the absolute backbone of an entire region's cuisine.
Welcome to today's deep dive. We are so thrilled you're joining us because today you and I are traveling to one of the most vibrant, complex, and, unabashedly intense flavor capitals on the planet. We're exploring the culinary landscape of Malaysia.
Yeah, and we're using a really incredible source as our guide today, a deeply researched text called The Food of Malaysia, Authentic Recipes from the Crossroads of Asia.
But our mission today isn't to just, read you a list of recipes or give you a basic table of contents.
Far from it. We are here to decode the culinary DNA of this entire region. When you stand in your own kitchen tonight, whether you're making a complex curry or just like a simple stir-fry, we want you to understand exactly why certain techniques work.
Right. We're going to trace the historical migrations that built this cuisine, analyze the specific physics of the traditional tools they used.
Which is fascinating, by the way.
Oh, totally mind-blowing. And we'll break down the precise chemistry of their spice pastes, and finally, unpack the spectacular dishes themselves.
Okay, let's unpack this. If we look back at the historical record, the ancient Greeks had a remarkably poetic name for the Malay Peninsula. They called it the Golden Chersonese.
The Golden Chersonese, which implies a place of immense wealth and allure, right?
Yeah.
But the real wealth wasn't just gold. It was location.
It's all about geography. If you pull up a map, Malaysia sits exactly at the convergence point of the trade winds, specifically where the monsoons meet.
Wait, so the weather patterns actually dictated the trade route?
Exactly. For centuries, if you were captaining a sailing ship coming from the west, from the Arabian Peninsula, the coast of India, or later from Europe, you'd ride the monsoon winds toward Asia.
Right.
But when you hit the Malay Peninsula, you literally could not go any further. You had to drop anchor and wait for the seasons to change so the winds would reverse and take you home.
And the exact same thing happened to Chinese junks and Siamese vessels coming from the east, right?
Precisely. So it wasn't an intentional destination at first. It was an enforced geographical layover.
That's wild. You have thousands of sailors, merchants, fortune seekers from totally disparate cultures, all just trapped together in these coastal ports for months at a time.
And what do humans do when they're stuck in a place for months? They trade, they intermingle, and they definitely cook.
They cook, yeah. They brought their spices, their cooking vessels, their preservation techniques, their distinct palates.
They set up localized communities. And over thousands of years, this geographical bottleneck created one of the world's original and most complex fusion cuisines.
But before we get to the fusion, before we start throwing Chinese woks and Indian spices into the mix, we have to establish the baseline. Because you can't have a melting pot without the pot itself.
That's a great point. What did the indigenous Malay kitchen look like?
Right. We tend to have this very monolithic view of Southeast Asia as just one big, steamy, tropical jungle. But the landscape is wildly diverse, and the regional cuisines reflect that.
Let's start way up in the north, in states like Kedah, Perlis, and Kelantan. The north is fascinating because it is the rice bowl of Malaysia.
Right, visually, it's a landscape of vast, flat, emerald green paddy fields, sharply punctuated by massive limestone karst formations.
But politically and geographically, it shares a porous border with Thailand, so the culinary crossover there is just immense.
Oh, I bet. So if you're eating in the north, you are going to taste that Thai influence immediately. It's not about thick, heavy coconut stews.
No, not at all. It's about sharp, zippy, herbaceous flavors. The flavor architecture relies heavily on intense sourness to cut through the oppressive heat of the region.
So they use a lot of tamarind.
They use tamarind extensively, but also local ingredients like sour carambola, which is a tart, astringent relative of the star fruit.
Interesting.
And they pair that sourness with aggressive heat from tiny, incredibly fiery bird's eye chilies. But what really defines the North is the foliage. They utilize a massive array of fresh, raw herbs.
Like what kind of herbs?
Things like pungent local basils and the highly aromatic wild gingerbud, which adds this floral, almost soapy fragrance to the broths.
Wow. Contrast that zippy, sour profile with the West Coast and the Highlands. Because if you travel just a bit south and inland, the geography shifts dramatically.
Yeah, you have the Malacca Straits, which are lined with these dense, muddy mangrove swamps.
And you might look at a mangrove swamp and think it's just muddy water, but ecologically, it's an incredibly rich nursery for marine life. We're talking massive mud crabs and sweet, succulent prawns.
And right next to that coastal bounty, you have the Banjaran Titiwangsa, the main mountain range that runs down the spine of the peninsula. And nestled up in those mountains are the Cameron Highlands.
Which is a crucial geographical quirk, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because of the altitude, the Cameron Highlands have a temperate climate.
Exactly. Which completely changes the pantry. It means local cooks don't just have access to tropical mainstays like taro root or bamboo shoots or water spinach.
Because the British colonials developed the highlands to escape the lowland heat.
Yeah.
Right? And they started growing temperate crops.
Yes, so you have locally grown cabbage, tomatoes, carrots, and broccoli sitting right next to the tropical ingredients in the wet markets.
It expands the culinary vocabulary immensely.
It really does. Moving further down the peninsula to the central and southern regions, places like Negeri Sembilan and Johor, the Thai influence vanishes entirely, and the Indonesian influence takes over.
Because historically, there was significant migration from the islands of Sumatra and Java across the narrow straits. The Minangkabau people, specifically, settled in Negeri Sembilan.
And their culinary philosophy is entirely different from the north. They aren't relying on sour, thin broths.
No, they are building deeply rich, intensely spiced, slow-cooked dishes that are absolutely swimming in thick, freshly squeezed coconut milk.
What's fascinating here is the physical necessity behind those heavy coconut dishes. The Minangkabau needed food that wouldn't spoil quickly in the equatorial heat, especially when traveling.
Ah, so cooking meat in coconut milk and spices until all the moisture evaporates, that creates a natural preservative barrier.
Exactly. That's the genesis of beef rendang, which we will dissect in detail later.
Finally, you have the East Coast states like Pahang. Historically, this side of the peninsula was isolated from the bustling western ports by those dense mountain jungles.
It faces the South China Sea, and its culinary tradition remained very simple, deeply reliant on what the fishermen pulled from the water that morning.
When your primary ingredient is fish caught just hours ago, the culinary logic dictates minimal interference. You don't bury it in heavy sauces.
Right. A classic dish from this region is ikan bakar, grilled fish. You take a perfectly fresh fish, rub it generously with turmeric root pounded with coarse sea salt, wrap it in a banana leaf to protect the flesh, and grill it over hot coals.
And the turmeric provides an earthy, slightly medicinal crust. The leaf steams the fish gently, and the smoke from the coals does the rest. So we have this wildly varied baseline pantry across the regions.
Yeah.
But there is a cultural institution that ties traditional Malay cooking together, regardless of the region. It's an event called the Kenduri.
Oh, the kenduri.
And from what I understand, comparing a Kenduri to an American neighborhood block party or a Thanksgiving dinner doesn't even come close to doing it justice.
Not at all. The kenduri is the pinnacle of communal Malay cooking. It is a massive, highly coordinated feast, usually thrown for significant life events, a wedding, a circumcision, or Hari Raya, which marks the end of Ramadan.
It represents a total mobilization of the village or the kampung. The logistics of this are staggering.
You have the women of the village essentially taking over an entire outdoor space. They haul out these massive industrial-sized cooking cauldrons.
And the sheer physical labor is mind-blowing. I mean, they aren't opening cans or using blenders. They're working through the night, manually scraping the flesh out of hundreds of mature coconuts to squeeze the milk by hand.
Standing over giant stone mortars, rhythmically pounding mountains of garlic, shallots, chilies, and tough woody spices into smooth pastes.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the kenduri is built on a foundation of reciprocal social capital.
Yes. You don't pay your neighbors to come scrape coconuts for your daughter's wedding. You do it with the unspoken, ironclad understanding that when their son gets married in 5 years, you will be the first one there with your coconut scraper.
The food itself is the social glue that binds the community together.
Beautifully said.
Okay, but I have to challenge this romantic image just a bit. Because the Malaysia of today is not just idyllic kampungs with chickens running in the yard and massive open spaces for cauldrons.
That's true.
It's a rapidly modernizing, highly urbanized nation. You have millions of people living in high-rise apartments in Kuala Lumpur. They commute, they work long hours, and their kitchens are tiny.
Right.
Doesn't this incredibly labor-intensive, village-style cooking simply become impossible in a modern context?
It is a profound tension, and it's something the culture is actively wrestling with. When you live in an apartment and work a 50-hour week, you simply do not have 3 days to prepare a spice paste and slow cook a curry.
Exactly. Plus, Malaysia boasts one of the most phenomenal, affordable, and ubiquitous street food cultures in the world.
From a purely economic standpoint, why would you spend 5 hours making a bowl of laksa when you can take an elevator down to the street corner and buy a masterclass version of it from a hawker stall for a few dollars?
Right. And you see the commercial response in the supermarkets. Entire aisles dedicated to prepackaged rempa pastes, canned coconut milk, and instant sauces. The shortcuts are becoming the standard operating procedure for the modern household.
However, while daily cooking is undeniably accelerating, the kanduri retains its sacred status. Even if they are buying modern shortcuts for Tuesday night dinner, the communal effort is still required for major milestones.
Yeah, there's a beautiful detail in our source material noting that Malaysian students studying abroad at universities in London or Melbourne will still pool their money, buy massive pots, and recreate miniature kanduri gatherings in their tiny student housing.
They do it because the physical act of cooking together is inextricably linked to their identity.
Okay, so we've set the stage. We understand the indigenous Malay foundation, the regional ingredients, the heavy labor, the communal spirit. Now we open the port doors.
Here comes the fusion.
We are going to look at the historical waves of migration that crashed into this peninsula and fundamentally rewired its culinary DNA. Let's start with the immense influence of the Chinese.
Chinese merchants had been making contact for centuries, mostly trading ceramics and silk, but the paradigm shifted completely in the 19th century.
Right. Massive deposits of tin and gold were discovered in the Malay Peninsula, and coal fields were opened in Borneo.
And the British colonial administrators needed cheap, resilient labor, so they facilitated the migration of tens of thousands of Chinese workers.
And these weren't just general Chinese immigrants. They were specifically from the southern coastal provinces of Guangdong and Fujian. And they brought their incredibly distinct regional foodways with them.
Unquestionably.
What was the most significant piece of technology they carried off those ships?
Oh, it was the wok. We will dedicate time later to the thermal physics of the wok, but conceptually, the technique of stir-frying changed everything.
Stir-frying is the process of cooking small, uniformly cut pieces of food incredibly rapidly over extreme roaring heat using very little oil.
It was a technique born of fuel scarcity in China, but it revolutionized how quickly food could be prepared in Malaysia.
And ingredient-wise, they brought the foundations of modern Asian cooking. Soy sauce, fermented bean pastes, tofu, bean sprouts. But the real game changer was noodles.
Yes. Before the Chinese arrived, the peninsula was overwhelmingly rice-centric. The immigrants brought fresh yellow wheat noodles, delicate flat rice noodles, and wiry dried vermicelli.
And noodles transcended the Chinese community and were rapidly adopted and adapted by every single ethnic group in Malaysia. There is a sociological observation about the Malaysian Chinese community that I find absolutely fascinating.
Oh, about their eating habits.
Yeah. The way they interact with food is almost relentless. They don't adhere to a rigid 3 square meals a day structure.
It's often joked that eating is the true national sport of Malaysia, driven heavily by this demographic. The day is a continuous rolling cycle of consumption.
Like, you wake up early for a light breakfast of hot noodle soup or steamed dim sum. By mid-morning, you need a snack, perhaps a flaky, savory curry puff.
Lunch is a substantial plate of rice with various braised meats and vegetables. Mid-afternoon requires a sweet treat and tea. Dinner is a communal, multi-course banquet of steamed fish and stir-fries.
And then, at midnight, you head out to an open-air hawker center for a late-night plate of fried noodles. It's incredible.
But they didn't just cook in a vacuum. They didn't isolate themselves and only cook pure Cantonese or Hokkien food. They immediately started surveying the local landscape and borrowing heavily from their neighbors.
This is the essence of adaptation. The Southern Chinese palate historically leans toward balanced, savory, and subtly sweet profiles. But in Malaysia, they encountered the heat of the local bird's-eye chilies.
Very quickly you begin to see a fusion. Today, if you sit down in a traditional Malaysian Chinese coffee shop for a mild bowl of clear noodle soup, there will invariably be a small dish of fiery, pickled green chilies or an intensely spicy red sambal right there on the table.
And they also noticed the fragrant curry leaves used by the Indian laborers and started throwing those into their searing woks.
Which perfectly brings us to the second massive wave of 19th century migration, the Indian influence.
Right, as the tin mines were filled with Chinese laborers, the British were simultaneously clearing vast tracts of jungle to plant rubber trees, anticipating the global boom in the automotive industry.
To tap those millions of rubber trees and to lay the tracks for the new railway system, they brought in massive numbers of indentured laborers from India. The vast majority of these workers were Tamils hailing from the southern states of India.
So they arrive and establish these localized, self-contained communities right on the sprawling rubber estates. They built their own temples, established their own schools, and crucially, they planted their own gardens.
From a culinary perspective, this was a highly synergistic migration. Southern Indian food relies heavily on deeply toasted spices, fresh coconut, and tamarind.
And the local Malay kitchen also relies on spices, coconut, and tamarind, so the integration was incredibly natural.
But the Indians brought highly specific flavor weapons. They introduced the sharp, sinus-clearing pop of tiny brown mustard seeds, which must be fried in hot oil until they literally pop to release their flavor.
Wow.
They brought earthy lentils like black gram dal, and most importantly, they brought the curry leaf tree.
Okay, let's clarify something for you, our listener. Right now, a fresh curry leaf has absolutely nothing to do with that yellow jar of curry powder sitting in the back of your pantry.
Thank you for pointing that out. Commercial curry powder is a westernized blend of ground spices, heavily relying on turmeric for color. A fresh curry leaf comes from a specific tree, Maria koniji.
Visually, it looks a bit like a small bay leaf, but the aroma is totally unique. When you drop fresh curry leaves into hot oil, they release this nutty, deeply savory, almost struck match-like aroma that instantly perfumes the entire dish.
You cannot substitute curry powder for fresh curry leaves. It just doesn't work.
One of the most brilliant culinary exports from the Tamil community is the banana leaf meal. It's an exercise in sensory engineering.
It's the original, sustainable, flavor-enhancing disposable plate. You sit down, and a massive, freshly washed, bright green banana leaf is laid out in front of you.
A server comes by and drops a mountain of steaming hot rice in the center. Around a rice, they spoon various wet and dry curries, a thin, intensely sour and peppery broth called ratham, cooling yogurt, and sharp pickled vegetables.
But the genius is in the physics of the leaf itself, right?
Exactly. The banana leaf isn't just a plate, it's an active ingredient. The waxy cuticle of the leaf contains subtle, grassy aromatic oils.
When the steaming hot rice and boiling curries hit that leaf, the thermal shock slightly melts the wax, releasing those oils upward into the food and into your nose as you lean over to eat.
But if we are going to talk about the absolute masterpiece of Malaysian Indian street food, we have to talk about roti canai.
Oh, roti canai is spectacular. Roti simply means bread, and canai likely refers to the city of Chennai in India. It is a direct descendant of the Indian paratha, a flaky, layered flatbread.
But the Malaysian interpretation incorporates a fascinating twist. It's a secret ingredient that completely changes the texture.
Right.
While a traditional Indian paratha relies heavily on whole wheat flour and water, the Malaysian roti canai uses highly refined, pure white wheat flour, clarified butter known as ghee, and a generous splash of sweetened condensed milk right into the dough.
That condensed milk is critical. It serves two purposes. First, the sugar in the milk aids in rapid browning and caramelization when it hits the hot griddle.
And second, the dairy fat shortens the gluten strands just enough to make the dough incredibly supple and stretchy.
And stretch it, they do. The physical creation of roti canai is pure street theater. If you watch a skilled roti man at a hawker stall, it's mesmerizing.
They don't use a rolling pin. They take a small ball of rested dough, flatten it with the heel of their hand, grab the edge, and in one fluid whipping motion, they throw it outward and spin it in the air.
They are utilizing centrifugal force to stretch the gluten network until the dough is literally paper thin and translucent. You can see through it.
Once it's a massive thin sheet, they quickly fold the edges inward, trapping microscopic pockets of air and layers of ghee between the folds of dough.
It's essentially the exact same physical principle as a French croissant, laminating layers of fattened dough to create flakiness, but executed in about 5 seconds in midair.
They throw this folded square onto a searing hot cast iron griddle. The trapped air expands, the ghee fries the dough from the inside out, and the sugars from the condensed milk turn it golden brown.
And then the grand finale. When they pull it off the griddle, piping hot, they place it on the counter and literally clap their hands together around the bread, violently crushing it from the sides.
This fluffing action breaks the internal layers, exposing the steam and creating a shattered, impossibly flaky, crispy, chewy masterpiece. You tear off a piece with your fingers and dip it into a rich, complex bowl of dal or chicken curry.
Okay, so we've covered the indigenous Malay foundation, the Chinese stir fries, and the Indian spices. But here's where it gets really interesting, because these groups didn't just live parallel lives.
No, in certain areas, they merge completely, creating a subculture that represents the absolute pinnacle of fusion. You are referring to the Nonya, or the Straits Chinese culture.
Exactly. Who were these people and why is their food so revered? To understand the Nonya, we have to rewind the clock before the massive 19th century migrations.
Centuries ago, during the height of the spice trade, early Chinese merchant pioneers arrived in wealthy port cities like Malacca and Penang.
Many of these men were successful traders who decided to put down roots. They settled there and married local Malay women.
So you have a literal, physical merging of two vastly different cultures under one roof. The men in these families were respectfully dressed as babas, and the women were addressed as nonyas.
Over generations, this intermarriage birthed an entirely distinct, highly sophisticated hybrid culture. They lived in beautifully ornate townhouses, wore hybrid clothing that combined Chinese silks with Malay sarong styles, and spoke a unique Creole language.
But their most enduring legacy is what happened in the kitchen. The culinary philosophy of Nonya food is fascinating. It basically takes Chinese hardware and proteins and runs them through a Malay software program of spices and techniques.
That is a perfect analogy. The Babas retained their Chinese heritage, which meant they did not convert to Islam. Therefore, they did not have the dietary restrictions that governed the Muslim Malay community.
Right. They eat pork.
But the Nunya wives running the kitchens were applying their local Malay techniques. So you see incredibly complex dishes where fatty cuts of Chinese pork are slowly braised in rich Malay coconut milk, soured with local tamarind, and flavored with pungent fermented shrimp paste.
They utilized Chinese dried ingredients like shiitake mushrooms, lily buds, and fermented soybeans, but cooked them down in heavy, pounded local spice pastes.
And it was agonizingly precise work. The historical texts portray the traditional Nonya kitchen as a place of absolute discipline. Young girls were judged on their eligibility for marriage based on the rhythmic, steady sound of their pestle hitting the mortar. Their knife skills had to be impeccable, slicing herbs so thinly they were practically translucent.
Which is exactly why authentic Nonya cooking is so difficult to find today. It is the antithesis of fast food. It demands a level of meticulous, grueling prep work that modern life barely allows.
But the resulting flavors are so spectacularly layered, simultaneously sweet, deeply savory, tart, and spicy, that there is a passionate movement to preserve these recipes.
To really illustrate how localized this cuisine became, our source provides the tale of two laksas. Laksa is a universally beloved spicy noodle soup. But the Babanonia communities were geographically split, some in the southern port of Malacca and some far to the north in Penang.
And because of that geographical split, they developed two entirely different versions of the exact same dish.
It is a brilliant case study in microgeography. Let's look at the southern version first. Malacca is geographically very close to Indonesia.
Therefore, Malacca Nonya Laksa, often referred to as Laksa Lemak, leans heavily into that rich Indonesian flavor profile. The broth is built on a pounded paste of dried prawns, fresh turmeric root, and galangal, and then it is absolutely ground in thick, luxurious, fatty coconut milk.
It is a heavy, creamy, comforting, deeply spiced soup. But if you travel a few hundred miles north to the island of Penang, the local Nonya Laksa is a totally different beast. You could not confuse the two.
Penang is geographically much closer to Thailand, and just like the indigenous northern Malay food we discussed earlier, the Penang Nonya Laksa adopts that Thai philosophy of sharp sourness and raw herbs.
The base spice paste is similar, but the execution diverges wildly. The most shocking difference, there's absolutely zero coconut milk in Penang Laksa.
None. Instead, the broth is a dark, murky, deeply tart gravy made by boiling down massive amounts of sour tamarind pulp and flaked mackerel or tuna. It's fishy, it's aggressively sour, and it's very spicy.
And it is heavily garnished with raw aromatics. They use mounds of that pink wild ginger bud, fresh mint, and a highly specific, intensely pungent, thick black prawn paste called heiko, which is swirled into the spoon right before you eat it.
It is a bracing, explosive flavor profile. So you have one culture, the Nonyas, creating two wildly divergent dishes based entirely on the agricultural and political borders of their immediate surroundings.
We should also briefly mention two final ingredients in this melting pot to complete the picture. In the southern port of Malacca, you still have a thriving community of Eurasians, specifically the descendants of the Portuguese Armada that conquered the city way back in 1511.
The Portuguese left an indelible mark, most famously with a dish known as devil's curry. It's an evolutionary descendant of the vindaloo from Goa, India, which was also a Portuguese colony.
But when it arrived in Malacca, the local cooks adapted it. They retained the Portuguese love of sharp white vinegar, but they ramped up the heat by incorporating a terrifying amount of local fresh and dried chilies and bruised local aromatics like lemongrass and galangal.
It is a dish defined by the aggressive friction between searing heat and sharp acidity.
And finally, far across the water in East Malaysia, on the island of Borneo, you have the indigenous tribes of Sabah and Sarawak. Their pantry is entirely different from the peninsula.
The inland Dayak tribes historically lived deep in the rainforests. They didn't have access to the bustling spice markets of the coastal ports. They relied on what they could forage and hunt.
They cooked wild boar and braised incredibly fresh, curled fern tips in the rendered fat. And critically, lacking any refrigeration in the suffocating jungle heat, they developed extreme methods of preservation.
Our source mentions a technique of preserving raw fish or pork by packing it in jars with salt and cooked rice and just leaving it to ferment for months. The text very politely warns that the resulting flavor is challenging to the uninitiated.
That is diplomatic phrasing. What is happening inside those jars is lactofermentation. The naturally occurring bacteria on the meat consume the sugars in the cooked rice, producing high levels of lactic acid.
This acid drops the pH level so low that harmful putrefying bacteria cannot survive, effectively preserving the meat. But the byproduct of this chemical reaction is an aroma and flavor that is staggeringly pungent, sour, and funky.
It is an acquired taste, but it is a vital part of the Borneo culinary heritage. So we know who is cooking. We understand the historical pantries they brought with them. Now we need to step inside the physical space of the Malaysian kitchen.
We need to look at the tools of the trade.
And I want to start with the most important one. The text calls the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of this tool the literal heartbeat of the kitchen, the batu lisong.
The mortar and pestle. Specifically, a heavy, deeply bowled mortar carved from solid granite with a matching stone pestle.
If you're listening to this and you're an avid home cook, you might be thinking, well, I have a $300 high-speed food processor on my counter. Why on earth would I spend an hour manually pounding hard roots with a rock?
Right. What is the scientific justification for this immense manual labor? It comes down to cellular biology. A food processor or a blender relies on a rapidly spinning metal blade. That blade slices through the ingredients.
Even if you run it until it looks like a paste, on a microscopic level, you have simply chopped the ingredients into millions of tiny, discrete pieces.
But when you use a heavy stone pestle to strike ingredients against a stone bowl, you are utilizing blunt shear force. You are crushing the ingredients.
This bruising action physically ruptures the tough cell walls of the herbs, the chilies, and the fibrous roots.
When you obliterate the cell walls, you release the volatile essential oils, the natural waters, and the aromatic compounds contained within. The liquids mingle and emulsify in a way that slicing simply cannot achieve.
A blended paste often tastes like a mixture of raw, separated ingredients. A pounded paste becomes an entirely new, deeply cohesive, synthesized flavor profile. It is vastly superior.
The next essential piece of engineering is the cooking vessel, the wok, or as it's known locally, the kwali, introduced by the Chinese but adopted by everyone.
The traditional wok is a conical bowl forged from cast iron or carbon steel, and it is an absolute masterpiece of thermal dynamics. Explain the physics of that shape. Why is the sloping conical shape so much better than a standard Western flat-bottom frying pan?
Well, a flat-bottom pan sitting on a burner has a relatively uniform temperature across its entire surface. A wok, however, sits directly down into the flame, creating distinct thermal zones. The very bottom, the small central pool, is blisteringly, fiercely hot. As the metal slopes steeply upward and outward, the heat dissipates.
So you essentially have 3 different cooking temperatures in one single pan.
Exactly. This allows the cook incredible control. You can sear a piece of meat in the screaming hot center and then use your spatula to push it up the cooler sides of the wok to rest while you introduce delicate garlic or fragile leafy greens to the bottom.
You can cook multiple ingredients with different thermal requirements simultaneously without burning anything.
There are also immense practical benefits to those sloping sides when you are physically tossing the food. In traditional stir-frying, you are violently jerking the pan back and forth. In a flat skillet, the food will fly out onto your stove.
In a wok, the sloping sides catch the food and naturally roll it back down into the hot center. It's physically designed to keep the ingredients in constant rolling motion.
Furthermore, because of the narrow bottom, you can deep fry a whole fish using a fraction of the oil you would need to fill a wide, flat pot because the oil pools deeply in the center.
There is a great practical tip in our source material for you, the listener, who might be inspired to buy their first carbon steel wok. If you bring it home from the store, wash it, and try to cook an egg in it, it will be a disaster.
Oh, it will stick horribly, and your food will taste intensely of raw metal. You must season it to create a natural, non-stick polymer coating.
The traditional Malaysian method is brilliant. You wash away the factory machine oil, dry the wok, and place it over high heat. You take a whole raw onion, cut it in half, add a generous splash of cooking oil to the wok, and use your spatula to vigorously scrub the inside of the hot wok with the cut side of the onion, frying it continuously.
What does the onion do? The sulfurous compounds in the raw onion react with the hot metal, helping to strip away any impurities and mellowing the harsh metallic taste.
As the oil heats up to its smoking point, it breaks down and bonds with the microscopic pores of the metal, polymerizing into a hard, slick, blackened surface.
You discard the blackened onion, rinse the wok with hot water, never use harsh soap after seasoning, and dry it completely over the flame. It is now naturally non-stick and protected from rust.
A few other quick tools worth mentioning. The cutting board isn't a thin plastic sheet. It's typically a massive solid cross-section of a tree trunk, about 4 inches thick.
That goes hand in hand with the use of the deep, heavy cleaver. In Western cooking, we tend to carefully fillet meat off the bone. In Asian cooking, poultry and seafood are often chopped straight through the bone into bite-sized pieces.
If you swing a heavy steel cleaver down through a chicken thigh bone on a plastic board, the board will crack or the blade will bounce dangerously. The dense mass of a tree trunk block absorbs the kinetic shock perfectly.
And for steaming, the ubiquitous stackable bamboo steamers. These are a beautiful example of form-meeting function. You place a wok filled with water over a flame and stack these woven bamboo baskets on top.
The magic of bamboo is its porosity. In a metal steamer, the steam rises, hits the metal lid, condenses into water droplets, and rains back down, turning your delicate dumplings or pho into a soggy mess.
The woven bamboo lid allows some steam to escape and absorbs the excess condensation. It acts as a natural moisture regulator.
All right, we have our ingredients, we have our heavy stone mortar, we have our seasoned wok. Now we arrive at the absolute core of Malaysian culinary technique. This is arguably the most important section of our deep dive. We need to talk about the rempah.
The rempah is the spice-based. It is the architectural foundation of almost every curry, braise, and stew in the cuisine. If your rempah is flawed, no amount of expensive meat or fresh coconut milk will save the dish.
And making a proper rempah is an exercise in strict sequential discipline. Walk us through this sequential grind, because if I just dump my garlic, my chilies, and my coriander seeds into the mortar all at once and start bashing away, it's not going to work.
It will be a textural failure. You must process ingredients based strictly on their physical density and their water content. Step 1 is always the dry ingredients. Whole spices like coriander seeds, cumin, fennel, and hard nuts like candle nuts.
You must grind these first into a fine, dry powder. If you introduce wet ingredients too early, the hard spices will just swim around in the moisture, dodging the pestle, and you will end up with a gritty, unpalatable sauce.
Okay, dry spices are pulverized. What goes in next? Step 2, the hard, fibrous roots. Specifically, ingredients like lemongrass stalks and galangal.
And there is a critical prep step here. You cannot just throw a whole chunk of galangal into a mortar. It is as tough as wood. You must use your cleaver to slice it paper thin against the grain, breaking the tough fibers before you even start pounding.
You pound these sliced roots into the dry spice powder until they break down.
Step 3.
The softer rhizomes and soaked ingredients, fresh, soft turmeric root, fresh ginger, and dried chilies that have been soaked in boiling water until they are plump and soft. These require less force to break down.
And finally, the wet ingredients.
Step 4 is where the magic happens. You add the ingredients with high water content, mountains of peeled shallots, cloves of garlic, and the soft fermented prawn paste.
As you pound these, they rupture and release their natural waters. This liquid acts as a solvent, gathering up all the dry powders and fibrous bits, binding them together into a smooth, deeply fragrant, cohesive paste.
It makes total sense. It's like building a complex perfume. You establish the dense base notes first and slowly layer up to the delicate, volatile top notes.
But pounding the rempah is only half the battle. The next step is a technique that, if skipped, will ruin your dinner. You must fry the rempa.
The phrase repeatedly used in our source text is that you must fry the paste until the oil separates. Understanding the chemistry of this step will change how you cook forever.
What exactly is happening in the wok during this step?
You heat a few tablespoons of oil in the wok and you scrape your freshly pounded wet rempa into it. Now, because that paste is full of water from the shallots and garlic, the temperature of the mixture cannot exceed 212 degrees Fahrenheit, the boiling point of water.
It is essentially just boiling the oil. It sounds loud, it's sputtering, and it looks pale.
And you have to stand there and stir it over moderate heat for a surprisingly long time, often 5 to 10 minutes. You are waiting for the water to evaporate. As you stir, the steam escapes. Eventually, the water cooks off entirely.
The moment the water is gone, the temperature of the paste is free to skyrocket, well past 212 degrees.
And that's when the Maillard reaction hits. The paste suddenly begins to truly fry in the oil. The natural sugars in the shallots caramelize. The harsh, sulfurous bite of the raw garlic mellows into a deep sweetness.
The fat-soluble flavor compounds in the chilies and spices, bloom and infuse directly into the cooking oil.
And the visual cue for the cook is the separation. The paste will suddenly tighten up, shrink, change to a visibly darker, richer color, and you will see the cooking oil now stain red or yellow from the spices bubble and pool around the edges of the paste.
That is the signal that the rempa is properly cooked. The warning here from the experts is dire if you get impatient, and you dump your raw chicken or your coconut milk into the wok while the paste is still wet and sputtering. Before the oil separates, what happens?
You have locked those ingredients into a boiled state. The raw, aggressive bite of the garlic and shallots will permeate the dish, the spices will taste powdery and harsh on the tongue, and the overall flavor will be flat and completely lack depth.
The patience required to fully bloom a rempa is non-negotiable. Speaking of adding liquids, let's talk about the final tricky technique mastering coconut milk. The book details a very specific two-stage process.
When you traditionally extract milk from a freshly grated mature coconut, you add a tiny bit of water and squeeze it hard. This first extraction yields thick coconut cream. It is rich, fatty, and luxurious.
Then you take that same grated coconut, add a lot more warm water, and squeeze it again. This second extraction yields thin coconut milk.
And you use them at completely different times in the cooking process. Thin coconut milk is a cooking medium. You add it to the wok after you have fried your rempa and browned your meat. It provides the liquid necessary to simmer and tenderize the meat.
But coconut milk is an unstable emulsion of water and fat. If you just slap a lid on it and boil it aggressively, the proteins will denature, the fat will separate, and the milk will curdle into ugly, greasy white clumps.
So how do the old school cooks prevent the split? Constant, vigilant agitation. As the thin milk comes to a boil, you must stir it constantly.
The traditional method is to use a ladle to scoop the liquid up and pour it back down into the pot from a height. This continuous physical agitation keeps the fat droplets suspended and prevents the emulsion from breaking. Once it settles into a gentle simmer, it's safe.
And the thick coconut cream. You hoard that until the absolute last minute. When the meat is tender and the curry is basically finished, you turn the heat down low and you stir in the thick cream.
You never allow the pot to boil once the thick cream goes in. It is used to gently enrich the sauce, give it a velvety, glossy mouthfeel, and impart a fresh, sweet, volatile coconut aroma that would be destroyed by harsh boiling.
Okay, we have our techniques down. Let's dig into the authentic ingredients glossary. We need to identify the raw materials going into that mortar and pestle. Let's start with the pungent powerhouses, circling back to that intense aroma I mentioned in the introduction, Belgian.
Belgian is the cornerstone. It is a fermented prawn paste. Tiny krill or small shrimp are caught, salted heavily, mashed, and left to ferment in the tropical sun for months until they break down into a dense, dark paste. It comes in solid blocks.
We talked about roasting it earlier. Why is that step so critical?
2 reasons. First, food safety. It is a raw, fermented seafood product. Roasting it ensures any lingering unwanted bacteria are destroyed. But secondly, and more importantly, it triggers a massive Maillard reaction.
Raw Belgian smells like rotting fish. Roasting it transforms the volatile compounds, changing the smell to a deeply appetizing, roasted, savory aroma. It provides an umami backbone, a depth of flavor that simple salt or soy sauce cannot possibly replicate. It makes the dish taste round and complete.
And we should contrast that with the other prawn paste we mentioned earlier, the one used in the Penang laksa.
Yes, Heiko, or Paytas. This is entirely different. It is a thick, sticky, molasses-like paste made from boiling down shrimp shells and sugar. It is sweet, extremely dark, and intensely funky.
You do not roast Heiko. It is usually diluted with a little hot broth and used as a finishing condiment to add a sweet, salty, fishy punch right at the end.
Let's move to the roots and leaves that give this food its signature fragrance. You mentioned galangal earlier. If I'm at the grocery store, can I just substitute ginger?
Absolutely not. They are botanically related, but culinarily distinct. Lengkuas, or galangal, has a tough, pale skin and a woody interior. Where ginger is warm, spicy, and slightly sweet, galangal is sharp, citrusy, and has a very distinct, piney, almost medicinal or camphorous aroma.
Substituting ginger for galangal will fundamentally alter the intended flavor profile of a Malaysian curry. What about the wild ginger bud?
Bunga Kantan. This is visually stunning, a tight, pale pink, spear-shaped flower bud of the torch ginger plant. You slice it microscopically thin. It provides a flavor that is incredibly difficult to describe if you haven't had it.
It is herbaceous, highly aromatic, slightly astringent, and deeply floral, almost like eating a fragrant perfume. It is the defining note in dishes like Penang laksa and various raw herb salads.
Let's talk about the essential leaves. There are 3 heavy hitters. First, kaffir lime leaves. These are unique double-lobed leaves that look like 2 leaves joined end to end. They contain immense amounts of citronelle, providing a bracing, sharply tangy, pure citrus aroma. You typically bruise them or tear them before dropping them into a simmer.
Second, laksa leaf, also known botanically as Persicaria odorata or Vietnamese coriander. It has a pointed, dark green leaf and delivers a flavor that sits somewhere between strong mint, lemon, and a subtle hint of eucalyptus.
And finally, pandanus leaves, or screw pine.
Ah, pandan. It's often called the vanilla of Southeast Asia.
That is the perfect analogy. The leaves themselves are tough and fibrous. You don't eat them. You tie a long leaf into a tight knot to physically bruise the fibers and drop it into a pot of boiling rice or a simmering dessert syrup.
It contains a chemical compound called 2-acetyl-1-pyrroline, which is the exact same compound that gives freshly baked bread or jasmine rice its comforting aroma. It imparts a subtle, sweet, grassy, almost nutty fragrance.
Moving to spices and souring agents. We mentioned the Indian influence bringing mustard seeds, but there is a trap here for the Western cook.
The text is explicit. Malaysian Indian dishes demand brown or black mustard seeds. They contain high levels of allyl isothiocyanate, which gives them a sharp, pungent, horseradish-like kick when popped in hot oil.
You should never substitute the mild yellow mustard seeds commonly found in Western pantries. The chemistry and flavor profile are entirely wrong.
And for sourness, if a Western cook wants to make a dish sour, they reach for a lemon or a bottle of vinegar. What is the Malaysian approach?
Tamarind is king, known locally as asam. It is the sticky brown pulp found inside the pod of the tamarind tree. You soak the pulp in warm water, massage it with your fingers, and strain out the seeds and fibers.
The resulting dark juice relies on tartaric acid, which provides a deep, fruity, complex sourness that is much rounder and less aggressive than the citric acid in a lemon.
They also use Assam gilligur, which are sun-dried slices of a very sour, apple-like fruit that you drop whole into a simmering curry to release a slow, steady wave of acidity over hours of cooking.
So think about this pantry for a second. We have rotting fermented shrimp paste. We have intense piney roots. We have leaves that taste like eucalyptus. We have the searing heat of bird's eye chilies and the deep tart pucker of tamarind.
If you just throw these together, it sounds like an aggressive, chaotic assault on the palate. How does a cook wrangle these incredibly loud flavors into something delicious?
That is the true genius of the cuisine. It is entirely dictated by the philosophy of balance. A masterful Malaysian dish rarely lets one single note dominate. It's an orchestration.
If you introduce the intense, abrasive heat of chili, you immediately temper it by flooding the dish with the rich, soothing dairy fats of coconut milk, which literally coat the capsaicin receptors on your tongue.
If you build a base with the deep, funky, salty umami of belashan, you slice right through that heaviness with the bright, sharp acidity of tamarind or fresh lime juice.
A cook might add a chunk of dark palm sugar to a curry, not to make it taste like a dessert, but because sugar chemically rounds off the harsh edges of salt and acid. It is a constant, dynamic tension between spicy, salty, sour, and sweet.
Okay. We have the geopolitical history, we understand the physical tools, we've mastered the Rempa technique, and we've cataloged the ingredients. It is time to synthesize all of this. Let's look at the actual menu.
Let's walk through the spectacular dishes outlined in the recipe section of the book, analyzing how they utilize everything we've just discussed. Let's start small, with samples and appetizers.
The absolute bedrock of the table is sambal belacan. It is the universal condiment. It is breathtakingly simple, but explosively flavorful.
You take a mortar and pestle, and you pound fiery, fresh red chilies together with a piece of deeply roasted belacan. You add a squeeze of fresh calamansi lime juice, which is incredibly tart and floral, and perhaps a tiny pinch of sugar. That's it.
It is served alongside almost every meal. It allows the diner to customize their own plate, adding a bespoke hit of heat, salt, funk, and acid to a mild bite of rice or fish.
And for a formal appetizer, the book details an incredible Nanya creation called Ku Pai Tea, or top hats. This is a masterpiece of textural engineering.
It really is. You use a highly specific tool, a long-handled, solid brass mold shaped exactly like an upside-down top hat. You heat a wok full of oil. You dip the hot brass mold into a very thin, watery batter of flour and egg, and then plunge the coated mold back into the roaring hot oil.
The thermal shock is key here.
Exactly. The water in the batter instantly vaporizes, creating microscopic bubbles that fry into a delicate, lacy, incredibly crispy pastry shell. The shell slips off the brass mold, and you lift out a perfect, hollow, crunchy little cup.
And what goes inside this crispy hat?
A mixture that perfectly balances sweet and savory. Finely shredded bengquang, which is jicama, providing a juicy crunch, stir-fried with minced garlic, sweet fresh prawns, a splash of soy sauce, and a touch of sugar.
You spoon this hot, savory filling into the crispy shell, top it with a tiny slice of fresh red chili and a shred of omelet, and you pop the entire thing in your mouth at once. The contrast between the shattering crispy shell and the juicy, savory filling is phenomenal.
Let's move to the rice and noodle section. We talked extensively about the wok earlier. What is the ultimate test of a cook's work skills?
Without a doubt, fried kway teow. This is a dish of flat, wide, slippery rice noodles. And the entire dish hinges on a concept the Chinese call wok hei, which translates poetically to the breath of the wok.
How do you capture the breath of the wok?
Through extreme, almost dangerous heat. You heat the wok until the metal is literally smoking. You add oil, garlic, fresh prawns, slices of sweet Chinese sausage, and the noodles, followed by a splash of soy sauce.
Because the wok is so incredibly hot, when the liquid soy sauce hits the sloped metal sides, it vaporizes instantly. Furthermore, as the cook violently tosses the noodles into the air, microscopic droplets of oil catch fire over the lip of the wok.
So the food is literally being kissed by open flame and vaporized soy sauce in midair.
Yes, this microcombustion singes the edges of the noodles and imparts a distinct, deeply savory, smoky, almost charred flavor that you simply cannot replicate on a weak home stove. Right at the very last second, you toss in a handful of fresh bean sprouts for crunch and raw blood cockles, which just barely warm through. It is a masterpiece of speed and thermal control.
Contrast that smoky, oily, fiery wok dish with a rice dish from the north, nasi ulam. This dish perfectly showcases that Thai influenced herbaceous border culture.
Nasi ulam is a room-temperature rice salad, and it is a masterclass in raw aromatics. You start by cooking rice with a bruised knot of pandan and lemongrass. But the magic happens when the rice cools slightly. You take a massive pile of raw herbs, the ulam.
The recipe reads like a botanical garden. Fresh coriander, mint, local basil, lemongrass stalks, wild gingerbud, turmeric leaf, and laksa leaf.
And the technique is crucial. You must roll these leaves together like a cigar and use an incredibly sharp knife to slice them microscopically thin, what the French call a chiffonade, but even finer.
You want to expose as much surface area of the leaves as possible to release the volatile aromatic oils, but you don't want massive, chewy chunks of raw leaves in the dish.
You toss this massive pile of shredded, incredibly fragrant greenery into the warm rice, along with toasted, grated coconut for richness, and perhaps some pounded dried fish for salty umami. It is arguably the most refreshing, complex, palate-cleansing dish in the repertoire.
Okay, we have to talk about the heavy hitters, the meat and poultry section. We teased it early on, and we need to fully unpack it now. Fragrant beef rendang.
The pride of the Minangkabau people, perfected over centuries. Rendang is often mistakenly called a curry by outsiders, but technically it is a masterclass in the reduction technique.
Walk us through the chemistry of a rendang.
You start by making an incredibly complex rempah heavy on the hard roots like galangal, ginger, and lemongrass, plus loads of chilies. You fry this paste until the oil separates. Then you add cubes of tough, muscular beef, and you absolutely flood the wok with thin coconut milk.
And then the true ingredient is thyme.
You simmer the beef gently, completely uncovered, for hours. Slowly, the water content in the coconut milk evaporates. As the water leaves, the sauce thickens and concentrates. The beef is tenderizing. Eventually, a critical threshold is crossed, the water is entirely gone.
So what is left in the wok?
Only the rendered beef fat, the fat from the coconut milk, and the intensely concentrated spices. The temperature in the wok suddenly spikes because water is no longer regulating it. The dish transitions from boiling to frying.
The beef begins to literally fry in the spiced coconut oil. This triggers a massive, slow Maillard reaction, turning the meat dark brown and deeply caramelizing the exterior.
And there is a final, critical textural component added at this stage, karasik. You take freshly grated coconut flesh, put it in a dry wok, and toast it over low heat, stirring constantly until it turns dark, dark brown.
Then you pound it in a mortar until it releases its oils and turns into a thick, nutty paste. You fold this karasik into the frying beef. It clings to the meat, coating it in a rich, dark, incredibly savory, nutty, highly spiced crust.
Because all the moisture has been driven out, a traditional rendang can last for days at room temperature. It is a triumph of culinary engineering.
In total contrast to the slow, heavy, coconut-rich rendang is the Eurasian dish we mentioned earlier, the chicken curry devil.
Exactly. This is where the Portuguese influence shines, and it is a shock to the palate after a creamy rendang. There is absolutely no coconut milk to soothe the tongue here.
The gravy is relatively thin, but the flavor is a massive, aggressive punch. It relies on the intense friction between sharp, acidic white vinegar and a frankly terrifying amount of fresh red chilies and dried chili paste. The acid amplifies the perception of the heat, creating a dish that is bright, sharp, and profoundly spicy.
Let's dive into the seafood section. Malaysia is surrounded by water, and the seafood culture is immense. Our source features a modern creation that sounds absolutely incredible and completely defies traditional boundaries.
Butter prawns.
Butter prawns is a relatively recent invention, likely from the 1990s, but it perfectly encapsulates modern Malaysian fusion. It takes a Western ingredient that has no historical place in a Chinese wok dairy butter and weaponizes it.
How does it work?
You take large, fresh tiger prawns, leave the shells on to protect the meat, and flash fry them in extremely hot oil for just seconds until the shells crisp up. You remove them. Then, you drain the wok and you drop in a massive knob of Western butter.
Butter in a screaming hot Asian wok. Yes. As the butter melts and foams, you throw in a handful of fiercely hot bird's eye chilies, minced garlic, and a massive handful of fresh Indian curry leaves.
The heat of the wok toasts the milk solids in the butter, creating a nutty brown butter profile. The dairy fat instantly extracts the spicy capsaicin from the chilies and the savory essential oils from the curry leaves.
It creates a spiced emulsion.
Exactly. You toss the crispy prawns back into this foaming, spicy butter, along with some toasted grated coconut, a splash of rice wine to deglaze, a dash of soy sauce for umami, and a pinch of sugar.
The result is astonishing. The rich, heavy dairy butter coats the palate, tempering the intense heat of the chilies, while the fragrant curry leaves cut through the richness. It hits sweet, salty, spicy, and rich simultaneously. It is completely addictive.
We also have to mention the black pepper crab. Another brilliant, messy fusion dish. You take fresh, local mud crabs, chop them into quarters right through the shell using that heavy cleaver and wooden block.
Then you stir-fry them in a sauce, heavily reliant on freshly cracked black pepper. Black pepper provides a totally different type of heat than chilies. It's a sharp, woody, lingering heat caused by the chemical piperine.
They mix that coarse pepper with fermented soybean paste, garlic, and oyster sauce. You have to eat it with your hands, cracking the shells, getting the thick peppery sauce all over your fingers to get to the sweet, delicate crab meat hidden inside.
We have survived the heat, the funk, and the smoke. We have to save room for dessert. And if you are expecting heavy baked goods or rich chocolate cakes, you need to completely reset your expectations. Traditional Malaysian desserts are built for a sweltering equatorial climate. Let's look at gula melaka.
Gula Melaka is actually the name of the primary ingredient itself, palm sugar sourced from the state of Malacca. The dessert is a masterclass in restraint. It relies entirely on the interplay of three distinct textures and the unadulterated quality of the ingredients.
The base is just sago, right?
Yes, sago pearls. They are extracted from the spongy center of tropical palm stems. You boil these tiny opaque pearls until they become translucent and chewy, and then you rinse them in cold water to wash away the starch and chill them in a mold.
On their own, sago pearls have almost zero flavor. They act purely as a textural canvas, a cool, gelatinous chew.
Then you add the richness. When you unmold the cold sago into a bowl, you generously bathe it in freshly squeezed, incredibly thick coconut cream. The cream is often spiked with just a tiny pinch of salt, which elevates the richness.
And then the crowning glory.
The syrup. You take blocks of pure, dark gula melaka, the palm sugar, and melt it down with a little water and a knotted pandan leaf. High-quality palm sugar is a revelation. It is not just overwhelmingly sweet like refined white sugar, it is complex.
It tastes deeply caramelized, slightly smoky from the wood fires used to boil the sap, with distinct lingering notes of butterscotch, coffee, and caramel. The cold, dewy sago, the rich, slightly salty coconut fat, and the smoky, complex, dark syrup form a perfect trinity.
And finally, we arrive at the ultimate tropical cooler ice kachang. Kachang translates to beans. Visually, this dessert is a towering, intimidating mountain of finely shaved ice. But the true genius lies hidden.
It's an exercise in excavation.
Yeah.
Because the ice is just the roof.
Exactly. Hidden at the very bottom of the bowl, buried beneath the ice, are the treasures. You have sweet, slow-cooked red adzuki beans, a classic Chinese ingredient. You have bright yellow canned sweet corn kernels, a Western introduction.
You have chendol, which are chewy, bright green, worm-like jellies made from rice flour and colored with fragrant pandan juice. And you might find translucent, chewy atape seeds from the nipa palm.
And once you bury all those distinct textures under a mountain of soft, powdery, shaved ice, the vendor goes to work with the syrups. It looks like modern art. The pristine white ice is drenched in vibrantly colored syrups.
Often a bright, shocking pink rose-flavored syrup, contrasting with dark brown streams of palm sugar syrup. And to finish it off, a heavy, cascading, generous pour of evaporated milk or sweetened condensed milk over the entire mountain.
So what does this all mean? I look at a bowl of ice kachang, and I am genuinely marveling at it. It is an edible metaphor. You have indigenous palm sugar, you have ancient Chinese red beans, you have 20th century Western canned sweet corn and highly processed condensed milk.
You have indigenous jellies. They are all layered together, trapped in one bowl under a mountain of ice. It literally looks like the cultural melting pot, served chilled.
It is the absolute, perfect, physical manifestation of everything we've explored today. Disparate, completely unrelated elements from all over the globe, carried by shifting winds, arriving in this one specific tropical location, and being combined by the locals into something entirely new, uniquely Malaysian, and incredibly delicious.
Let's recap the journey we've taken today. We started by anchoring our ships at the monsoon-swept trading ports of the Golden Cursinese. We dug deep into the indigenous Malay kitchen, understanding how the geography from the cool, temperate vegetable farms of the Cameron Highlands to the mangrove swamps dictated the original pantry. We witnessed the incredible, grueling communal labor of the Kenduri.
We tracked the massive demographic shifts brought by Chinese tin miners fleeing poverty, bringing their roaring woks and continuous eating culture. We followed the Indian rubber tappers who brought their curry leaves, mustard seeds, and the physics of lamination for roti canai.
We marveled at the Baba Nyonya culture in Malacca and Penang, synthesizing Chinese ingredients with complex Malay spice pastes. We stepped into the kitchen and felt the literal weight of the batu lesum, understanding why blunt sheer force creates superior flavor compared to the spinning blades of a food processor.
We learned the absolute necessity of the sequential grind for a perfect rempa: dry, hard, soft, wet. We unpack the precise chemistry of frying that paste until the water evaporates, allowing the temperature to spike and the oil to separate, triggering those crucial Maillard reactions.
And we explored a wild pantry full of pungent roasted belacan, medicinal galangal, sharp tartaric acid from tamarind, and the fragrant floral wild ginger buds, culminating in an array of dishes that execute a high-wire balancing act between spicy, salty, sour, and sweet.
I want to connect this directly back to you listening right now. Even if you have no intention of tracking down wild ginger buds to make a Penang laksa tonight, the fundamental culinary truths we unpack today apply to literally anything you cook.
Think about the last time you made a stew or a curry at home and it tasted a bit flat, or powdery, or the garlic was too sharp. Understanding why you must bloom spices in hot fat rather than just dumping them into a watery liquid, understanding the physics of heat zones in a pan, or understanding how adding a tiny pinch of sugar can round off the harsh edges of a sour sauce. These are foundational principles that will elevate your cooking, whether you are making a complex Asian braise or a simple pot of chili.
Absolutely. The physics of heat transfer and the chemistry of flavor extraction do not change based on your zip code. They apply everywhere.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought. It's a bit of a paradox regarding Malaysian food that our source text really illuminated for me.
It is a profound paradox that gets to the heart of modern food culture. Malaysian cuisine, as we've spent the last hour discussing, is born entirely of incredible global speed and movement. It is the product of fast-paced international maritime trade, rapidly migrating populations, and shifting dynamic empires. It is the literal food of the crossroads.
Yet the food itself, the actual mechanics of producing it, demands the exact opposite of speed.
Exactly. The food demands immense, unyielding patience, incredibly slow cooking, and massive communal labor. It requires women sitting up all night, talking and working, manually scraping coconuts for a kanduri.
It requires an individual standing over a heavy stone mortar and pestle, physically exerting themselves for an hour to perfectly crush a rempa. It requires simmering a rendang, watching the bubbles, waiting for hours until the liquid agonizingly slowly evaporates so the meat can fry in its own fat.
So the question is this. As the world continues to accelerate, as Malaysia and the rest of the globe increasingly urbanizes, as those apartment kitchens get smaller and work hours get longer, and as we rely more and more on the convenience of prepackaged spice mixes and instant pastes, what happens to the soul of a cuisine?
What happens when the time it takes to pound a fresh rempa by hand, or the time it takes to slowly bloom those spices until the oil separates, is considered a luxury we simply can no longer afford?
It's the central tension every great culinary tradition is facing right now. The relentless march of convenience versus the painstaking preservation of craft. When we lose the labor, do we lose the flavor?
That is something for you to ponder tonight as you step into your own kitchen. And while you're pondering, I highly encourage you to bypass the blender. Dig out a heavy stone mortar and pestle, throw some garlic and chilies in there, and see what happens when you crush your ingredients instead of just slicing them. Because sometimes throwing out the neat, modern architectural blueprints, slowing down, and getting a little messy is where the real culinary magic happens. Thanks for diving deep with us today.